Go.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this latest edition of Practico's podcast. Present as ever is Andy Ellis, Managing Director of Practico, and myself, Jeremy Morgan, consultant to Practico and retired costs Silk. And our guest today, we are really honoured to have today, is the about to retire senior cost judge. So my first thing to say, welcome to the pensioners from costs, but I suspect it's not as simple as that. Couple of practical questions. First of all, is there a date?
End of October, so the last day of October.
Okay. And do we have a successor yet, or is that a state
No,
secret?
the Judicial Appointments Commission selection exercise to appoint my permanent successor is ongoing. It started about a month or two ago, and won't conclude, I think, until the new year, because these processes take a long time. So my permanent successor, I doubt will be announced until February next year.
Right.
In the interim, Jason Rowley, a very experienced cost judge, will be the acting senior cost judge. So he should be in post from 1st of November to whenever next year the
Right.
permanent successor is named.
I must say I can't believe it. It's been such a short time. It seems like only yesterday that you've got the job. Certainly to me, anyway. Is there what's in the pipeline then for you after this? Is it off to 39 Essex like Peter Hurst, or back to your old
No,
chambers?
no.
No.
I think. I mean, I've been assessing bills for 30 years. I started as a deputy taxing master, as they were then, in 1994. So I've assessed quite a few in the last 3 decades. And I think, I mean, I can't rival Peter Hurst's longevity, certainly not in the job, or his enthusiasm. So I'm going to take a break from costs
Yeah.
and law, and I will sort of pursue other non-legal things, which sort of interest me.
Well, I'm entirely with you on that. I must say, I think it's very good for the soul to get away from the law.
Well, I mean, I'll give it a try. If, on the other hand, I feel an urge to come back, if I feel that there is this gaping hole in my life in the shape of costs, then who knows? I may seek some minor role somewhere. But I think that's probably, at the moment, I think that's unlikely. I think I've been doing it for long enough, and I think people have put up with me for long enough. I mean, October, which is when I go, is bizarrely. It'll be 30 years almost to the day since I was appointed a deputy, 21 years almost to the day since I was appointed full time, and 10 years almost to the day since I was appointed the senior cost judge.
Yeah.
So with those anniversaries of 10, 21, and 30 all happening, around about pretty much the same week, I think that's an indication from the gods that the time has come. This won't be repeated for another 10 years. And although, despite appearances, I could do another 9 years until my retirement age, I think it's unlikely that these stars will align in that way for a very long time. So
I think the problem that senior lawyers usually have, particularly senior members of the bar, is not so much that they feel that they can't do with the job; it's that the world can't do without them being in the job because they've made such an important contribution.
Yeah.
But anyway, love to do that, and all the best
Thank you very much.
in whatever comes from now on. Obviously, it would be useful for all those watching to have a brief reflection on your time in the SCCO, particularly probably since you were in the senior job. Might just sort of look at it. I look at it kind of this way: the last few years, from the period when you became a full-time cost judge in 2003 till about the time you became senior cost judge, that sort of 10-year period was dominated by the cost wars and all sorts of shenanigans that Jackson was intended to bring an end to. And since 2014, there has been quite a different scene But how would you compare those two decades, if you like, 10-year periods?
Well, can I go back a little bit further? So when I started as a deputy, I mean, the world of costs was very different, and most of the work here seemed to be sort of commercial bills. That there was quite a lot of personal injury and a huge amount of defamation. And when I started full time, I think the commercial work was beginning to reduce, and personal injury was very much the lion's share of the work. And as you say, obviously the costs all really sort of kicked off in around about the early 2000s. So yes, we became effectively absorbed with the costs war, and I think probably the costs office was identified very much with the battles between defendants and insurers in personal injury work. At around about the same time that the legal aid work that we used to do almost disappeared. So we were terribly busy doing PI. The defamation work sort of disappeared over time. I can't remember the last time I've saw a defamation bill. I mean, as I say, we used to see almost endless defamation bills 25, 30 years ago. So the work has changed hugely. Now, since 2014, our fairly significant diet of clinical negligence seems to have reduced significantly. I think personal injury has reduced significantly, but we're now seeing more commercial bills and more solicitor and own client bills. So yeah, the workers, it goes up and down. I don't know how that's reflected in the court. I mean, when I was at the bar, as you were, Jeremy, you know, the corridors of the Queen's Bench Division, as it then was, and the Chancery Division, then in the main building, and were just full of people between, you know, about 9 o'clock and 10:30, and really were smoke-filled corridors. Often you had difficulty getting from one end to the other because there were just so many people outside court. The last 10 years or so, they're just completely empty.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that work has gone. I mean, it's gone. But I don't know where it's gone.
I went through the bear garden 2 or 3 years ago, sort of for old time's sake, and I couldn't believe it was empty.
Yeah. Again, it's empty, and you just wonder where has all that work gone. It hasn't gone, I think, to mediation. It just presumably settles.
Well, quite a lot also done online, presumably.
Yes, possibly, yeah. So I don't know. I don't have the statistics to hand, but I don't know the extent to which civil claims are settling earlier than they did. So there are fewer trials, or just whether there are fewer big civil claims. I think if you look at the statistics overall, the impression you're given is that civil work grows, but I think a lot of that is probably debt actions and possession actions in the county court, and the big work. Well, I presume it just settles.
And the decline of PI and Clin Neg, to some extent, due to Jackson reforms,
Yes.
one would imagine. Just standing back, would you say that the Jackson process was successful, or has it just generated as many problems as it solved?
Well, it depends how you define success. I think he's probably achieved what he set out to do. I had a meeting with him before, just as he was started, when he was given the job. So this would be around about, I don't know, 2005, I suppose, 2006 then. And he wanted to understand the world of costs. So he made an appointment to have a chat with Peter Hurst. And Peter Hurst said, well, rather than talk to me, talk to somebody who was a barrister, so probably knows as little about costs as you do, but he might use the sort of simple language that you understand. So we had a chat, and I mean, his enthusiasm was just amazing. I mean, he as you know, he absorbs everything, and he inquires about everything, and you know, amazingly interested in everything he does. And I think I said to him at the time, I think the problem is the low value PI claims where, the sort of whiplashes where the damages are about 3,000, but the costs are 50,000. And that's really what's damaging the reputation of civil justice. And I did say, and of course there's a problem with success fees, but I almost brushed that aside because I thought, well, nobody could do anything about recoverable success fees. They're here to stay. And I think I possibly said, although this may be wishful thinking on my part, that if you try to get rid of recoverable success fees, you just won't get anywhere because the position is so entrenched, and you'll be fighting a whole industry. And he managed it, and I thought that was his big success. That recoverable additional liabilities go, but the work carries on, and people hopefully are able to make a profit from doing these cases without defendants having to pay double the amount of costs. And with the irrecoverability of additional liabilities, then we lost an awful lot of the arguments on detailed assessment, because most of the time in PI and thin leg cases, everybody was really worried about the success fee or the CFA or the retainer point. And once you dealt with, is there a valid CFA and is the success fee reasonable, then as often as not, the costs would settle. So I think from a costs perspective, it's worked because it's reduced the scope of the scope of argument, particularly in PI and clin neg.
I was always, when I was an assessor on his committee, I was always in favour of abolishing the indemnity principle. It seemed to me that would solve a lot of the pointless arguments in costs. But that, although he supported that, it didn't get through. Did you have a view on that now, a few years on?
I think now it's not such a big thing. So
because even PACCAR isn't really an indemnity principle issue. It's more about whether you've got funding that meets the requirements.
Yes, yes, that's right. I think it's because people aren't paying success fees, and the costs tend to be lower, and people don't get quite so excited about the retainer issues that we used to have, and whether there's a CFA which complies with the statistics. So often now people just don't raise it in defendants or paying parties don't raise it in PI and clinical negligence cases. That they just assume, well, it's probably compliant, and we get on with what they really want to argue about.
Do you think if I just come in there, one of the things that Jackson also did was to redefine the proportionality test, and from my perspective, that's probably not been a success in terms of standing back, and although it still forms a very useful way of introducing a detailed assessment and what the paying party feels most hard done about when they're seeing the size of the bill in front of them. Nevertheless, I don't think my view is I don't think it's had quite the effect Jackson probably intended it to have. Would you agree with that, or do you have other views around the?
No, I think you're absolutely right. So you'll remember the talk about Singaporean tests and blood on the carpet and all of that, and that revolved around two aspects. I think more generally in relation to relief from sanctions, that court orders have to be complied with, and we do have probably. I think that has worked to an extent, although it wasn't quite as draconian as it first appeared. I think proportionality, again, we all thought, gosh, this is going to be much more severe, and I think one or two cases tried to make it more severe, but it's weakened over time, and I can't think of a case where I've assessed a bill on the reasonableness basis and then stood back and said it needs further reduction. I did back in 2014, 2015, because that seemed, sort of the zeitgeist. But that's disappeared over time. And I think part of the problem is that when you've been through a bill and you have reduced it significantly on a reasonableness basis, it is difficult then to say, well, it's reasonable, but still it's not proportionate, because I think when you're considering the reasonableness, you're also taking into account, possibly subconsciously, factors such as the value of the claim and the complexity and everything else. So, I mean, it may be that in reality proportionality doesn't really add much, if it's designed for the sort of case where you're really arguing about very little and spending an awful lot. I think generally you can get to the right result just applying reasonableness. But you're right. I mean, it hasn't had the effect that we thought it would have.
Budgeting, however.
Sorry?
Budgeting, however.
Budgeting, however, well, that's not something I do a lot of. But that's obviously had a huge impact. I mean, whether it's successful is, I suppose, a question of of looking at the ends. I mean, the ends were to control costs at an earlier stage, and it's probably succeeded in doing that. I think it's probably succeeded in reducing the scope of argument on detailed assessment, because the courts have been fairly stringent, I think, in adopting the words of the Court of Appeal in Harrison that cost judges shouldn't be too astute to find a good reason to depart from the budget. And I think I mean, certainly in my experience, it's pretty rare that you're going to find a good reason to depart from the budget. So in most cases, once you've dealt with the incurred costs, which of course can be significant, you sort of glide over the budgeted costs if you don't find a good reason. So that probably halves the length of the average detailed assessment. You may have a little argument about whether there's a good reason or not, but if there isn't, then that's it. So
well,
I think
sorry, no, I'll cut you off.
No, don't worry.
What about a further role for cost judges in the budgeting process? In other words, in setting the budget. Do you think that's something that might come in or might be useful?
Well, it sort of has come in, and I think in reality it's always been there. When the Jackson reforms came in, that there was a view that costs budgeting and directions should be part of the same process. A sort of, I'm not sure if synergy is the right term, but they effectively they fed off each other, and you tailor the directions to the budget and the budget to the directions, and so it had to be done by the same person. So that obviously cut out the cost judges, because we don't generally give case management directions. But the question was raised a year or two back in the context of the Civil Justice Council report on costs, and it was pointed out there that in fact that there is nothing in the rules that requires cost budgeting and case management to be done by the same judge, and it's perfectly appropriate in some cases to split them out. So the report that the CJC produced and was accepted by the Master of the Rolls effectively encourages that process, that in an appropriate case, the case managing judge will give directions and then will effectively transfer the budget over to somebody else. And that was done, I think, with a degree of enthusiasm in some quarters in the King's Bench division, or greeted with some enthusiasm in the King's Bench division and Chancery divisions. But I have to say, I haven't seen a single case in which the judge has given directions and then transferred the cost budgeting over to a cost judge. So it hasn't happened yet, as far as I'm aware, except in group actions, where it has been the norm for cost judges to be pulled in to do the budgeting part of it, once directions have been given by the managing judge.
Yeah. Do you think it would assist if people were to take, if you like, more seriously the suggestion that cost judges should do that?
Well, I would hope that judges who just do costs should have I'm not suggesting other judges don't have this ability, but I would hope that cost judges should have a good feel for what reasonable budgets should look like. And I think if we can remove or at least reduce waiting times for CMCs elsewhere, then that would be helpful. I mean, it really depends on the practice in individual courts. I mean, I know some courts do separate directions from budgeting, and there's probably more logic to sending the budgeting off to a cost judge. I mean, another problem obviously is that an awful lot of case management is done out of London, and there aren't any cost judges out of London. There are regional cost judges, but they're busy doing all sorts of other things. So it's probably only going to be useful in cases proceeding in the High Court in London.
I was thinking probably the biggest change which has taken place during your period was not so much changes in the law as COVID and the need to move so much of your work online. How would you, clearly the feedback I've got from people is that the cost office was very good at managing that transition, which could have been I'm sure, terrifying for you to contemplate. How do you, looking back, how do you rate that process?
I mean, with probably a fair dose of looking through rose-tinted spectacles back at the what was an awful period, it seemed to go reasonably smoothly. I mean, we had no experience, very limited experience of doing hearings by video. We were using Skype. I don't think we had Teams to begin with, or anybody had any experience of it. I don't think any of us really had much experience of Skype. So we had to get into it pretty quickly, and it was, I think, reasonably seamless. I mean, our staff did amazingly well because they're setting up the hearings, they're sending out the invitations, and that involved a whole new set of skills that they had to acquire almost instantly. And in fairness, the court service, which isn't necessarily known for its innovation and speed at adopting technology, provided just almost out of the blue laptops for the staff to work from home. So they were able to, again, fairly seamlessly set up hearings and send out invitations and record and not lose the recordings and all of that stuff, which was new to them and which they were doing from a laptop probably in their kitchen or wherever. So I mean, I suspect if I rewound the tape and looked back to the first week of the first lockdown, then it was probably very different to how I recall it. But it seemed to go quite well. But even if we did get off to a stuttering start, which I suspect is probably the reality that I don't remember, I think we picked it up pretty quickly. And of course we had
sorry, the other impact, of course, was everything was now digital. So the paper,
Yes.
the boxes of paper files became largely a thing of the past.
Well, that was a huge benefit that we had, I think, certainly by comparison with the county court, because in January of 2020 we moved to compulsory electronic filing, so all the court files were digital. So the bills, points of dispute, all of that were accessible from anywhere. And once, to begin with, obviously we had the problem of solicitors lodging their files on paper, because fair enough, they're working on paper. They can't suddenly, if they've got a hearing which starts in the first week of the first lockdown, they can't suddenly transfer it all into a digital file. But very quickly, the profession did move to, if not digital working, then producing digital bundles for hearings, and that made all the difference. I know to begin with, we were sort of driving in through the deserted streets of London to collect boxes for our hearings, but I think within a few weeks we were pretty much working from digital files, and now everything is a digital bundle. Any detailed assessment now, it's all done digitally. It doesn't need to be. It can be done by solicitors lodging papers, but I can't remember the last time I had the boxes of papers that we used to get, which is good for my back. My back is very grateful that we are now working from electronic bundles. And again, it seems obviously solicitors have mastered the art. Some seem to do it much more efficiently than others in terms of the cost, because inevitably now the cost of preparing bundles is a cost which we see in every hearing. But some do it very well. I think that's probably, there must be some clever software that helps. Some seem to spend hundreds of hours doing it, and you wonder why.
You lived through that period as a participant, Andy. What would you say?
Well, I think, as I said before, I'm sensitive about talking about associating COVID with anything that could be thought of as a benefit, but it's as an accelerant. I think it's been enormously helpful, and I think that because of the needs must, one of the things that probably helped to accelerate it was that there was no time to develop a government designed hosting service. You had to rely on third-party applications, and therefore people had to, for a time, whatever works, be it Skype or Zoom or Microsoft Teams or so on and so forth, as that developed. And I'm not saying that security leaks could not have happened, because maybe they could, but the fact that everybody got on with it with a sort of a can-do attitude was extremely helpful. And I think I would imagine now that the days of people in all sorts of areas, sort of all jumping on trains from Manchester to come down to London for a 3/4 hour conference with counsel that ship sailed. That's gone. Yeah. And although it's really quite refreshing to go back and have the occasional face-to-face meeting with people, that getting the balance right has been something that's been very helpful. And I think that the online hearings worked extremely well. More difficult a hybrid when some people are some people are remote and some people are in person. But certainly the digital side of it seems to me there's a long way to go with making that slicker in terms of being able to compile bundles and present them and index them, and everybody having the same sort of standard. The software that we use, which has speeded up things enormously, but as Andrew just sort of said, not everybody has it, and therefore sometimes things take longer than perhaps they should. But that'll even out. over time, I think. And obviously the other thing that we haven't mentioned, and we don't want to send the audience to sleep with talking about the electronic bill, and certainly the history of how it came into being. But certainly that we're very pleased that, because of the size of the work that we do, as much as anything else, that is now the norm and accepted. Although Excel has its limitations and imperfections, when you're dealing with large amounts of numbers, there really is nothing that is as accurate or flexible as that. And the fact that everybody's had to go to school on it, and it takes a long time, has been a great advantage to accuracy, and also the tidying up jobs after assessment, so on and so forth, are so much faster.
Would that, Andrew, thinking of the judge's point of view, does that also help in decision making? Because you can just change a figure and see what the effect would be of reducing the hourly rate, or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience of the electronic bill is slightly mixed. I appreciate I'm speaking to the two architects of the electronic bill. It's useful in hearings, provided that the points of dispute have been drafted in a way where the objections are linked to activities. Where you get points of dispute which challenge each item one by one, starting at item 1 and going down to item 999, then it becomes seriously problematic. But that's something we need to address by a change in the rules, I think, to indicate how we should expect points of dispute to be drafted. So when it works well, then it works really well. I think it's beneficial to paying parties because it enables them to analyse what is being claimed much more clearly, and they can obviously dig right down into the weeds to see exactly what's being claimed and why, because the paper bill was somewhat opaque. So it just, when it's in the hands of the gifted, then it works well. When it's not in the hands of the gifted, then it can be a bit of a slog. So that's hearings. I mean, the problem that I think we have is provisionals, where effectively the judge is left by themselves to work their way through an electronic bill. And if, again, you're younger than me and you have more experience of Excel, then you'll probably get through it faster. But I think some judges will just start off with item 1 and go down to item 999. It'll take them 3 days to do it, rather than the less time that it would take if it were a paper bill.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're seeing it used much more in court of protection cases, where we introduced it. If I said 2 years ago, it's probably 3 years ago. So it's now not mandatory, but it's you can use it if you prefer to, and we're seeing much greater take up in court of protection. We do 12,000 court of protection bills a year, or we receive 12,000 court of protection bills a year. So it's a very big part of our work, and I think people are seeing the advantage of drafting bills, and I think the costs officers here, who do most of the assessing of COP bills, are happy, and I think that any disadvantage in terms of them getting used to the electronic bill is probably now been defeated by experience. So I think the electronic bills, I think, are the way forward. I mean, there are no plans to extend them to other cases. As you know, they're mandatory only in claims which are subject to a cost management order, so that they're essential, I think, in budgeted cases, because there's no way of drafting a paper bill which accurately sets out phases, tasks, and activities. So I think their importance is that they're essential in a budgeted case, but they seem to be becoming increasingly popular in non-budgeted cases.
The other, it's not really development because costs have always got greater. If you look back 10 years, the bills are always 10 times what they were 10 years ago. But you had quite an issue on your hands in the Deutsche Bank and Sebastian Holdings case, where even just procedurally, apart from the £53 million claim, there was quite a lot to deal with. And you rejected a proposal for a sort of staged process where the paying party didn't know what bill they were facing. Any reflections on that as a process?
Well, Deutsche Bank had I can't really talk about cases where I've given a judgment because it might be thought that I'm amending the judgment. So the problem of that sort of case, which I can talk about.
Yeah, sort of procedural problems, if you like.
Yeah, so procedurally, where it is a huge bill in relation to a huge case, my view is that the paying party is entitled to know at the outset what is being claimed against them. I mean, apart from the difficulties of how can you expect people to make offers and settle if they don't know what's being claimed against them. I can't see that it's going to be appropriate in any case that I can think of for effectively the paying party to receive the bill in chunks. So they produce a bill for a bit, which is then assessed, then they produce a bill for the next bit, which is then assessed. I think they're entitled to know from the outset what's being claimed. Now, I appreciate that in litigation that doesn't always happen. So you may get a bill on liability following a liability trial, and then 2 years later you get a bill in relation to quantum. But where you have just had one trial which has dealt with everything, then I think there should be one bill which you then assess, however big it is going to be.
But one still has to be creative to try and at least resolve some of the problems of.
Yes, I mean, yes. So they're doable. I mean, Deutsche Bank took a long time, but the detailed assessment took a long time. But that wasn't necessarily because of the size of the bill. In large part, it was because that there had been difficulties in recording time, and it effectively in that sort of case where people don't record their time as clearly as they could, then those working for the receiving party have to undertake this sort of forensic archaeology task of trying to work out what the fee earners were doing. So if you get somebody, for example, partner saying working on case 10 hours with nothing else, somebody's got to try and work out what they were doing in that 10 hours. And that is a huge task. Maybe years after the event, you're going back, often with only emails as a guide. There are no file notes, no attendance notes. You're just trying to work out what was done. So that's a challenge in a lot of commercial bill assessments.
You could take the view that was the solicitor's fault, and that if you don't record, you don't get.
Yeah, I mean, as well, that probably is the principle you have to follow. But I think you've got to give them an opportunity to try and come up with an explanation.
Yeah.
But that is a problem with big city firms, that they don't record their time necessarily in the same way as everybody else. And that may be because their bills are rarely challenged, and so they don't see a need to change the way they operate just for the odd bill that is challenged. But where a bill is challenged, whether by the other side, their opponent in litigation, or by their own client subsequently, it is difficult if you have to try and effectively reconstitute time ledgers after the event.
It brings the solicitor and client sort of disputes brings me on to the next thing I was going to mention. One of the big headline topics, I suppose, during your period has been the increase in solicitor and client challenges, certainly during the days of checkmylegalfees.com, and that seems to have abated a bit. Do you think? I think you're an advocate of a reform in the area of the Solicitors Act, aren't you?
Yes. I mean, the Solicitors Act has 1974 has a very long pedigree. It goes back to the Attorneys Act of 1725, and not a lot seems to have changed. The 1/5 rule that we're all familiar with used to be the 1/6 rule back in 1725, but that may just be the effects of inflation or deflation. It's something that really does need looking at, and I'm pleased to see that it does look as though it is going to be looked at. I mean, following recent comments by the Master of the Rolls, the Civil Justice Council has been given the task of considering reform of the Act, and that I think is long overdue. I mean, it does seem odd that a profession that is involved with seeking clarity, it has for its own regulation such an opaque system of charging clients. And I mean, in practical terms, on solicitor and own client assessments, in almost, I would think, half the cases, the first issue is going to be whether the bill that the client is seeking to have assessed is actually a bill, or whether it's a request for money on account. And that's quite bizarre. I mean, why don't solicitors know how to bill? I appreciate the Act is complicated, and the body of law that has developed around the Act is complicated. But you get really big firms doing huge amounts of work for vast sums of money, but they're not getting their billing right for often, absurd reasons. They're just not putting something on the bill that makes it a bill, or they haven't got something in their terms and conditions that enables them to serve interim bills. So it does need a shake-up. I think removing a lot of the technicalities around billing would help, but also I think making the way that the way that solicitors charge more transparent, I think, would also be helpful. So it is quite a big task. I'm sorry I won't be there to see it through, because I have been pressing for reform of the Act for some years, but hopefully with a push by the Civil Justice Council, then the government will act on its recommendations, and we'll see something that's more helpful both for solicitors and for their clients.
But another aspect of your role, which you've touched on, is reform, or sort of behind the scenes discussions about potential reforms. It struck me from my time in the profession, Peter Hurst was the one who really sort of initiated or was invited to be pretty active in those discussions behind the scenes. And I think you've picked that up and run with it. It's always struck me as extremely important that the head of the cost office should be an important element, if you like, of considering reform. Is that something that you've been happy with and interested in doing?
Yes, I mean, I started as senior cost judge effectively just as the Jackson reforms were coming in, and I think everybody's saying, well, that's a once in a generation opportunity until the next the next 10 years, and so that I suppose my first few years then were effectively pushing through those reforms to ensure that they were enacted, and I think that was part of my job description. And obviously that included the electronic bill, which was a one of Rupert Jackson's recommendations. So I've been happy to propel those reforms and try to bring them into force in a way which works. I'm not aware of any significant, I mean, apart from the work being done on the Solicitors Act and obviously the extension of fixed costs, which is really just a continuation of Jackson. I'm not aware of any great concerns at the moment that there should be further reform. And the outstanding reforms, obviously fixed costs has now been extended. Clinical negligence, fixed costs, I don't know what's going to happen to that. Obviously there's been a change of government before the rules were introduced, and they haven't happened yet. I don't know what will happen to them, but I don't get the impression that, save in relation to the Solicitors Act, there is a great appetite for further reform.
The only thing, of course, is it would be nice if there were a bill to replace the bill that fell with the election.
Yeah.
Or it would be if you believe in third-party funding, put it that way.
Yeah.
But that's something which I think we're still waiting for.
Yeah.
Look, this has been a really interesting discussion. Andy, you've been in full-time practice throughout the time that Andrew Gordon-Sake has been senior cost judge. A reflection from you.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I mean, I came into cost just probably slightly before Andrew, but not much before. So I think that although we've been on very different tracks at different levels, I mean, we had a lot of hearings before Peter Hurst, and we've had a lot of hearings before Andrew. And certainly from when I first came into the profession, one of the terrible things about detailed assessment was that you'd have the odd taxing marshal, as they then were, who might really sound off and shout at you. Andrew's never done that. and that's been fantastic for the blood pressure, I have to say. I always think it's been great that I suppose it should be the starting position that a judge is fair, but in terms of giving everybody a fair hearing and really understanding the practical issues behind what it must be like to run a practice, and really appreciate that. And as he says, at least give an opportunity for somebody to backfill what they might have been doing 10 years ago when they wrote down working on a case for 10 hours. These little things, when they add up, are extremely helpful, and they result in some very wise decisions. So, I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of ourselves and everybody I know who's been before you over the years, and either been involved in the edges of committees or in detailed assessment hearings. And obviously, we hope you have a very long and happy retirement. I'm glad you're starting earlier than you need to that extent. And I'll hope to follow that lead, but I sense I'll fail. Carry on far too long. But there we are. We'll see.
There was a time, I recall, when the judicial pension was paid for an average of 2 years. And I always found that a terrifying figure, because it either meant people had retired too late, but at that time, I think the retirement age was 70, or it meant that as soon as they stopped judging, they had no interest in life. It just fell off the perch calmly after a couple of years. Both of those prospects seem to me rather frightening. I can't echo Andrew's comments on your period as senior cost judge, because I, by and large, wasn't there. But I certainly echo what you said from the appearances I had in front of you when you were in your previous role. But just from the sidelines, I very much welcome the fact that the senior cost judges, both Peter Hurst initially and then you, have carried on this tradition of fighting for costs and doing everything you can to make the system work. So with that, many thanks for your career, but also many thanks for coming or today.
Thank you.
And every good luck in your retirement.
Thank you very much.